Welcome to the House of Jesus. House of Jesus communities are those that are constantly aligning themselves to Jesus, the cornerstone. Accordingly, they preach and teach the words of Jesus, and they walk out his ways. The vision of this video series is to unpack Jesus' culture of godly love and equipping-based empowerment. As we do so, we will detail the biblical foundation for our convictions, as well as provide practical strategies for implementing the Master's ways. But be assured, walking out Jesus' ways is not a decision, but a lifelong calling and process. We are humbled that you are joining us on this quest. The 9th video is entitled The Equipping Value of Transition and has been recorded in partnership with Drew Stedman, a church planting catalyst. This teaching unpacks the 5th value of Jesus' culture of equipping-based empowerment, namely honoring transitions. Like the Father, Jesus helps his disciples adapt to change by transitioning them to their next right step of faith. As we summarize Jesus' ways, listeners will learn that transition is a value modeled by God. Transition is focused on helping people adapt to change, and transition is only life-giving if it flows from godly love. My prayer is that this resource accelerates your alignment to Jesus' ways. This last session, Drew, focuses on the value of honoring transition, and this process is challenging. It really reveals more about the heart of the equipping leader than any of the other values, because helping servants lead well is challenging, really, for any situation. It requires a lot of us as an equipping leader who's putting in more than we take out to do this well. And I think the first place to begin is just to be sure we're on the same page in terms of definitions. The way that I'm using change today is in the context of either a decision or an external event that catalyzes a measurable shift in reality. My parents died a little over 10 years ago. That was a change. Transition is the human process of adapting to that change, and it often involves a range of emotional responses. My parents were not believers, and the transition and the processing of their death was much more complex, much more difficult than I could have ever imagined. So change, again, is a decision. It's just something that happens. COVID is a change, but transition is how we personally adapt to those changes. Grief is a common part of transition. So as we use the word transition, we are talking about things that are triggered by changes. Servants succeed and take on expanded roles. Servants fail and need a new direction. So change is not necessarily good or bad per se, but obviously there are some transitions that are more difficult than others. So equipping leaders like ourselves need to be wise as we guide various types of transitions. And, this passage with Jesus is just a great example. He's caring for Peter in the aftermath of his failure, and he is stepping in to assist him in that transition. There are a variety of passages that relate to transition biblically, and Drew, Jesus' 40 days of helping disciples deal with the change of his death and resurrection and the transition that occurs because of it always has stood out for me as a great example. What example stands out for you biblically as it relates to the challenges of transition?
One I like and also I don't like is the Paul and Barnabas story. And I don't like it because it's sad. And it makes me think, like, gosh, if we have, two of the great apostles and saints of the early church, if they can't get along, what hope is there for us? But what I like about it is how normal this is, that sometimes you have great people, they just can't make it work. And there's transitions that take place from it. And, it's sad. You can see the grief in this story, but then by the end, you also see the reconciliation of God. And what is cool to me is that God, even in a painful transition, Barnabas goes on and has a really fruitful ministry on the island of Cyprus. Paul goes on and has a fruitful ministry throughout Asia Minor and into Greece. And John Mark ends up having a ministry as well. And so God is able to work through our humanness. But what I take from it is that we're not going to escape translation. If they had transitions like that, where sometimes it is something like a death, or you think of Elijah getting handed off to Elisha. That's one I haven't seen. There's a lot I have seen, but I haven't had a golden chariot yet. Where you have, not a golden chariot, flaming chariot. But I haven't seen a flaming chariot yet. So there is a variety of reasons for transitions, and ones you've mentioned. But the Paul and Barnabas story reflects the reality that relationally things sometimes don't work out. But God still is faithful, and God is still good. And I think, my conviction when I look at this is that we will not escape transition. And I think there's a fallacy that we can have in leadership that if we work really, really hard and we do a really good job, that we'll somehow being able to avoid navigating transitions. And I've had to come to the conclusion of recognizing that I will, for the rest of my calling as a leader, be navigating transitions. And I myself will have times of undergoing transitions. And so we can either learn to embrace them and recognize God's hand in the discomfort of a transition, or we can resist them, which in my experience has typically only made things worse.
Right.
So with that background biblically, Charlie, as we pull back to our template, let's drill in more on this fifth part of the process of honoring transition. And I really appreciate your different drivers here. First one is discernment, which applies, whether the person you're walking with is really fruitful or not. And this is something I've had to recognize, that I need to be discerning even with somebody who's doing a great job in their role and causes me no problems. Like, I still need to be thinking, not just how do I, keep them to keep doing the stuff they're doing, but how is God leading them as a disciple of Jesus, and where is God leading them into and creating space for that? But then, probably the one that is more front and center if you're a leader is when that's not going well. Somebody's not being successful. They're not taking the steps that are needed. And discernment is going to apply either way. And then your second driver is a Charlie Halley original word in your lexicon, carefrontation. And I think it accurately captures the heart of what's going on there. And we'll get into that in a second. But before we get to carefrontation, Charlie, take us into this first one a bit more. What do you mean by discernment?
Yeah, the last time we were talking about coaching, you had suggested some really good questions that you would engage your disciples and those you're leading, just to check in with their heart and their perceptions. And the answers to those futuristic questions that you ask will often trigger a need for discernment. In other words, the discernment we're talking about right here is not the first time that you're thinking or observing or reflecting on what's going on with individuals. That really begins in the coaching process. And so by the time we are discerning now, at this juncture, we're really kind of asking our questions: when is this going to take place? Is now the time for a change? If not, when is that? So this is an ongoing process of active listening, plus a lot of prayerful wisdom. Obviously, we want to be attentive to the servant's anointing and figure out and understand, there are just many different aspects that trigger the need for a transition. Drew, as you and I know too well, sometimes the catalyst for a change is failure. This is a very difficult part of the process of equipping individuals, even though we've done a great job of coaching them and we've gone through multiple assessments and we've done our best to enable them and help them to be successful. Sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes the reason it doesn't work is because of us and the things that missteps that we've taken. At other times, it's choices that they've made. I know, unfortunately, that you deal with this in your work, and I'd love for you to add to what I've shared here in terms of four common reasons, what are the kinds of things that you see most often and are dealing with as you step into situations where people have failed?
I think these four capture so much of it. And it is you've hit the tension in this is sometimes it's on them, sometimes it's on me. And something I've learned is most of the time it's a bit of all of that, all of the above.
Mm.
Where I can look back and see, gosh, I skipped a step, I rushed their apprenticeship in this area, I didn't correctly discern exactly what that role would require, and maybe the person didn't show quite the same passion that was needed, or overestimated their own skill set, and in their interview process, we missed it. And it gets complex, and that makes it painful. And there's been times where we've needed to initiate a transition with somebody, and I look back on it and realize that a good reason why that happened was my own fault. I didn't correctly discern what the role needed. And so that's hard because you still have to make the decision, but also need to take ownership of your own part in that. So a few examples of the types of things, there's the obvious example of a major moral failure, and that certainly does happen from time to time. I think probably what I run into the most is either a misalignment with the job just straight out the gate. And I think as a general rule, once you realize that there isn't an alignment, it's better to just go ahead and name it and work on it right away, rather than waiting and hoping that someday the alignment might come together. And that happens, and that's unfortunately pretty common. But a second one is you can have someone who's actually in a position for a long time, and churches are dynamic. They don't stay the same. And if a church stays the same, that's maybe a sign that it's not growing or not growing into the calling that God's given it. And so we should expect it. We should expect that the roles within our church will look different 10 years from now. And it's very rare to have somebody whose job does not undergo significant change over the course of a decade. So let me put this in another way of looking at it. If you have a team today, the chances of that team all being in the same role 10 years from now is virtually zero. In fact, the chances of any member of that team having the exact same role as they do today is virtually zero. So even if someone maintains the same title, what probably is going to happen is the responsibilities that they carry will be very different a decade from today. And so that's a driver behind all of this is churches are always growing, always changing. And there are a lot of people that God has gifted, anointed, called, wonderful people that are servants in the church. But as the church changes, they're not always able to make that same change. And I think, before God, a lot of times they're not supposed to. That's not their calling. But we still need to be able to recognize that and discern that and help them step into what God does have for them.
Drew, that's really good. And I appreciate all that you said. And as you were talking, I was just reflecting on it's why the value of anointed fit, which we've already talked about, is so, so important. It's so painful to bump up against the failure of our hiring process and or even us dropping the ball. So anointed fit and patient apprenticing, the better you do that, the less likely it is that you end in this difficult situation in needed transition.
That's great, Charlie. And that gets us into some of our best practices here. And there's a few that we want to highlight of how do we do the process of discernment. First, we need to remember that anointing is dynamic. And that's what we're speaking to, that the needs for a particular season are going to change. And so we want to establish anointed fit, which applies for the season that you're in. And sometimes that anointed fit will move on you. It'll change on you. But we certainly want to do as much as we can to at least determine point in time today, what has God called us to and who has God called for this position? And that's that process that you were just referring to, Charlie. But even if we get it right today, tomorrow it might look different. We need to anticipate the impact of new seasons. Now, this one I think is very easy to overlook, and we could look at it on both a corporate level and on a personal level. So when the church undergoes change, it's so easy to not recognize how radically that's going to alter those who work with the church. Mm-hmm. And we were talking before we started today, Charlie, and we were talking about the impact of things like a new building, or how about if you get a new senior pastor or hire an executive pastor, you fundamentally altered how your staff operates in a really significant way that's going to affect virtually everybody on the team. And so these are things that some of them are obvious. If you bring in a new boss, we might recognize it, but it's less obvious if the church doubles in size over the course of 4 years to realize what a major impact that new season is going to have on those who serve in the church. I always think of this one from a church planting perspective. It's rare to find a worship leader who is the right fit for a church of 50 that will be able to grow with that church to being a church of 500. The chances of them growing at their anointing and gifting exactly parallel to the growth and the anointing of the church is, it's rare. It happens. And I know wonderful stories of it happening, but new seasons do impact who the right fit is for a role. So this is on a corporate level, but it's actually also on an individual level. Something I've seen is when people get engaged, have a first child, become an empty nester, there's even milestones. I found around the age of 30, a lot of people start getting really serious about, who am I? I've spent a decade in some form of work and service, and now I'm starting to lock in a bit more on my gifting. And so be aware of that. When people undergo life milestones, it rightly causes them to change. God designed them to grow. That's actually, they are partnering with how God leads us as people, but that does impact their job at times. So when you see a new season with one of your team members, that should always just be a little sign for you to check in and be aware that part of that could always be a transition that God might initiate. And the third one is expecting the unexpected. A little bit of a play on words here, but really, like, there will be surprises, things that catch you off guard. And what I've learned is I cannot always determine what those will be, but I can definitely prepare for the fact that they will be. It's going to happen. The larger your team, the more it's going to happen. You'll have somebody that's in a role, you think they're there for life, and they call you and say that they have to go move back home to be near their aging parents, and they feel led to go take care of them. It could be a very negative, unexpected thing, and it could be a very positive, unexpected thing. Maybe they feel God's prompting them to support a spouse who needs to go pursue higher education. Maybe God is leading them to go plant a church of their own. We just need to be prepared for that and not be close-fisted with the people that God sends our way. And then lastly, be proactive when servants struggle. And this is maybe the more stereotypical side of transitions. I think what we all fear is having to fire someone or guide them through a process of mutual discernment, ideally, to help them identify the fact that they might not be the fit for a role. One thing I've learned with this is hoping that someone changes and magically grows into a fit for your role is not a good strategy for dealing with somebody who's struggling in their job. And I said it earlier, I'm going to say it again because this is worth repeating. If you just bury your head in the sand and wait, it will only make it worse. When someone is struggling, you've got to step in. And in fact, if you step in quick enough, you might be able to turn it around. You might be able to identify a gap where maybe they didn't get the apprenticeship they need or the clarity they need or the resources they need for their own development in the role. And you might be able to rally resources around them and help them step into it. So that can happen. But if you just look the other way and hope it gets better, it's not going to work. A practical example of this is if you have a children's pastor or a youth pastor and you start to hear grumbling with parents that they aren't connecting well with the parents or the parents of your church are dissatisfied. If you don't get on top of that right away, even if they grow into the role, they will have eroded trust to the point where they're not going to be able to stay in that position. Yeah. If you immediately step in and start having some honest conversations, and we're going to get to that here in a second with Carefrontation, then there's actually a chance that you might be able to help them and turn it around. But you can't wait. You can't sit back and choose to ignore it because you're too busy doing other things. That's where some of our greatest problems have been, letting that kind of thing go on, sometimes for years before really dealing with them.
True. I like, again, the way that you're describing it really reflects on the reality that the things that we're dealing with in this transitional value are things that start beforehand, whether that's in the interview process, the hiring process, and patient apprenticing and coaching. When those things are not working at their best, those typically create these transitional issues that we have to deal with. And this next driver of Carefrontation, I think, is one of the most challenging of all the drivers. It is the challenge of authentic and gracious communication that is needed by servants who are not succeeding. Tough love is the combination of care and confrontation. And so this is a delicate balance, and it is a huge challenge. Again, this is very important that Carefrontation should never be the first time someone is hearing about a systemic problem that they have. Now, we're not talking about moral issues, because there are some things, obviously, that choices that people can make that instantly result in their termination as a staff member or their termination as a lay leader. In confrontation, we're really talking about non-moral issues. We're talking about individuals who are not in the right place, or we haven't trained them well. And so we never want to bring them to a place of understanding that a change is about to take place when they've never heard about it before. Honesty and transparency almost always precedes tough love, just like correction almost always precedes rebuking. Confrontation is when the straw breaks the camel's back, in my mind. I come to a place as a leader, as an equipper, as someone who is invested a lot in people, but I realize it's not going to change. And now I need to say something. I need to do something to catalyze that transition. So, Drew, what I'd like to do is kind of walk through some of the things that are on my radar for how to do this well. And it's difficult and it has to be customized to each individual. But these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in terms of tough love after I have prayed a lot about this situation. So I'd love for you to jump in as I go through these. The first thing that I'm thinking about in confrontation is to be overly gracious. This is not about shame or condemnation. This is not about using my power over them. I actually find myself pulling back a little bit and not being as tough sometimes as I could be. Yes, I've made a decision. Yes, this is, things are going to change. But I want to be overly gracious. If I make a mistake, I'd rather be overly gracious than overly harsh. The next one is, actually the next two kind of fit together. Don't fight, but agree to disagree. What that means is that in the midst of confrontation, I'm going to share my perceptions. It is totally valid, and it's almost always the case that the person that I'm trying to minister to has different perceptions. But I'm the decision maker. It's my responsibility. I want them to understand my perceptions. I need to listen to their perceptions, but we're not going to fight about it. I have my thoughts and observations, and so do they. And so I don't want to try to convince them. I haven't been successful already to convince them in many respects. So I just need to share my thoughts and allow them to share theirs and keep moving forward. Need to treat people fairly. If I treat people unfairly, it's going to get out and it's going to make it very difficult to maintain the trust of the people that I lead and invest in. So really important to be sure that whatever decision that I've made, that it's fair. And sometimes fair is reflected in severance packages and in all kinds of ways. You have to think about what it means to be fair. Continuing, I definitely need to be specific as needed with clear examples. And this is where the desired outcomes really serve you well. If you've just given responsibilities to people and it's fuzzy what success looks like, it can be very difficult to be specific because yes, you led youth group, but that didn't work very well. But if you've defined what a successful youth group looks like, then I can be specific in regards to the contrast between the desired outcomes and the behavior and or the results. And so this is where your diligent work on the front end can help you a great deal. So this next one, Drew, is something that you might have experienced. There are times when I feel like it's very important to have someone else in the room, just kind of a check in my spirit, a nervousness that I have about how this is going to go. I've never felt unsafe with anyone that I was taking through confrontation, but I have felt as though there were individuals who were having a really hard time hearing me and understanding what I was saying. So sometimes I've invited them to bring someone with them, a spouse, a friend, so that there would be other individuals who could hear what I was saying. There have been occasions where I didn't have confidence that that individual or situation wouldn't blow up, and I wanted to protect my back. And so I would invite someone, another staff member usually, who would be in there with me, not making any comments, but just being there to hear the same things that I'm saying and how they respond. Sometimes in those situations, I also want to summarize on paper afterwards, or even sometimes beforehand, what I'm going to say. It's very difficult to hear confrontation and really pick up the nuances of words. And so sometimes I think it's best to be able to hand a person a piece of paper that summarizes all of this, whether that's for a spouse or for their own review. Obviously, it's a documentation of what I've said. Speaking the truth in love is better than resentment. You know, there are times when I have become resentful of staff members, and I've actually learned that resentment, the first time I'm resentful, probably means it's time for confrontation. In other words, it's an instant cue that I actually have made a decision and that we've come to the end of possibilities. So I've shared a lot there, Drew. I'm sure you have something to add. This is so difficult, and again, is different in every case. And prayer is an essential precondition. So, what are your thoughts as you were listening to these?
I think you did a great job summarizing this, Charlie. And what you said right there at the end, I find to be very helpful. Of when have we crossed the line from a frustration, maybe where I am working with someone, to an honest recognition that we're at the end of what we're able to do here, and that going any further is only going to lead to pain for them, for me, and for the rest of the church. And that's something, it's not easy. And I think for those called to ministry in particular, I find most pastors struggle with this, where they are long suffering to an extent, and they're willing to keep walking with somebody, but not always honest on when it's time to have this type of conversation. And when they do have this kind of conversation, it can feel uncomfortable. This isn't why people get into ministry, for having to do this, but it is unfortunately a really important skill that we can have. A few things that you said here, I want to just underscore. One is write it down. It doesn't mean you have to show the person. Sometimes I will, if I feel that there is a lot of room for a misunderstanding, I will both verbally say it, and as a general principle, always verbally say it first, but then hand it to them afterwards so they have it, but at least in your own notes to save it. Second, if you have made a decision, I would encourage you, whatever your oversight structure looks like, make sure that you have gone to them and it's not just you. I think in a situation like this, it's really helpful if this is not just a person and Drew are in conflict and I'm making a unilateral decision, but it's an issue of me as a representative of the church. We've been walking through a process together, and through a process of discernment, those entrusted with the church have determined that we are not able to go any further. And that can look very different. That's firing a full-time staff member would be different than a life group leader who just isn't able to lead a life group at the level that you're needed. So you'll have to use your discernment on how much of that needs to happen depending on the situation. And then lastly, when I get to these types of conversations, normally what I try to do is define the win. And typically the win is that when I see them at the grocery store, I can give them a hug and there's not awkwardness. I think there can be this thing inside of us that wants to be justified. And I'm so glad you brought this up, Charlie, where it's like, I want to prove to you why I'm right, and just maybe stick one last little thing in to try to convince them to see my way. And often once you're at this point, you're probably not going to see fully eye to eye. Sometimes you are. Sometimes that person will just acknowledge this isn't working. But normally that's not a confrontation conversation. It's a different type of conversation. So typically at this point, you're just not going to see eye to eye, and they may not respond very well. And so I want to be honest. I want to be clear. And I'm not trying to get them to see my point of view, but I'm trying to acknowledge, our relationship matters more than them seeing my perspective. And the decision's been made. They're going to be stepping on into a new place. And so I can be very gracious at that point and treat them as well as I possibly can. I'm a big believer in wherever we can, giving severance. Most people are sacrificing for ministry in a pretty significant way. So even if they didn't do a great job, it's still worth honoring the sacrifice that they made.
Well, this final driver is transition, and I know that's redundant since it's honoring transition, but I haven't come up with a better phrase for this last process, which is really important. The basic gist of transition as a driver is that you don't want to let go of people until they've landed on their feet in a new context, if at all possible. And one of the easiest examples or images of this is when you're in a relay race and you're passing the baton, you don't want to let it go until it's been grabbed on the other side. And that's really the heart behind this driver is you're wanting to do whatever you can to be sure that the person has gotten through this process, has landed somewhere. Obviously, if it's within your congregation, that they've found a new place to serve and get connected, even if the individual has transitioned off the staff and has landed somewhere else. I really think it's important to continue to pray for individuals that you've gone through this process with. I do pray for all the people I invest in, but I don't, as soon as I'm through with the confrontation process, it's not as though I stop praying for them. I'm wanting them to be healed and learn from whatever this journey has been about. And obviously, I need to learn as well at times. So this is really the driver behind, or the heart behind this particular driver. Drew, part of this process too, for me, is having some kind of conversation with individuals. Sometimes the confrontation is not the last time I have a conversation. I think exit interviews, exit conversations are really important. Sometimes people have had a few days to reflect on the conversation that we've had. And I want it to be a time that's both personal and hopefully life-giving. And so I've got some talking points. What are the kinds of things you think about as you have final conversations with individuals as they are moving on in ministry?
I think a good question you can ask yourself is 3 years from now, how will you wish you had that conversation? And try to separate yourself from all the emotional dynamics that led up to it, and just get a bit of perspective. And I'm going to go back into the Paul and Barnabas story here for a second. I wonder, and I'm purely speculating in scripture here, but I wonder at the end of their life, as Paul's getting martyred in Rome and all these churches, I bet if he could go back, he probably still needed to acknowledge in that moment that we're on different wavelengths here and a transition is needed. But maybe some of the bitterness that you read about could have been lessened. And it seems like later in life, they were able to do some of that repair work. But that's what I see in this is I want to try to get some perspective as much as I can. I can't control the other person. And I think that's a really important point here. And transitions can be so very different based on the person. There are some people where you might actually have an opportunity to maintain an ongoing relationship with them. Maybe it's they're in a role, there's somebody God's called you to, that role didn't work out, but you keep walking together. And that can happen from time to time. And I've been in some environments where that's been the case. Probably more typically is you're able to maintain relationship, and you can even ask permission. Are you okay if I check in with you from time to time? That type of thing, but also blessing them as they go into a new season, and supporting them and encouraging them. And if you hear that they join another church and they're doing great, celebrating that with them, just doing that kind of thing. And then every now and then there's somebody where they're not able to see past the pain of it, and you're going to have to trust God and release them and let them move on. But it's what's best for them. And so if what's best for them is that you don't keep chasing them down, but you allow them to have the emotional distance they need. And that can be hard sometimes, because I've been in situations where I know people are having a hard time, but from my perspective, I felt like I handled it well. And so I just have to trust God with my reputation and my desire to feel justified, and think, actually, for this person's sake, they need their space and they need an opportunity to just get away from it. And it's remarkable how often, if you're willing to love people well in the moment and do as best you can what's right for the person, 3 years from now, how God brings things back full circle, and there's able to be a restoration, even in some of these situations that are pretty painful at the time. So here are a few examples of some things that you can be thinking through in conversations like this. A principle to keep in mind is that God is committed to this person and he's guiding them and leading them. Something that helps me in moments of transition is the recognition that if someone is not succeeding in a role that they're in with me, that God has another role for them where they will be able to walk in the fullness of their calling.
Right.
And as hard as it might be up front, by me being willing to guide them through a process that's a much faster runway for them to actually walk in what they're called to do, which is going to release so much grace and contentment and joy for them in the long run. And so it's actually more loving to help somebody get into their long-term assignment. That can be done in a way that's unloving, in a way that's painful. So we obviously don't want to be doing that. But some of these types of questions can help us think beyond, they're not getting the thing done for me that I want done, and instead start to think through, how has God wired this person, and what might be the best fit for them where they can actually thrive in their area of ministry. I remember my dad telling me the story of, he was an executive pastor at a large church, and they had a bookstore, and there was a manager of the church bookstore that just wasn't doing great. And so my dad ended up needing to go through a process with this person, and it wasn't easy, but they were able to guide him into a new season. And today that person's a CEO of a large company and just thriving and doing awesome. You think through stories like that time gives some perspective. And so this helps us to see, and this is what we get to when we're talking about baton passing, is we're just trying to help people in their journey as a disciple of Jesus move into their next season. That's the spirit of it, despite the complexity. All right, Charlie, why don't you take us into our first takeaway that we hope you got from this teaching?
Yeah, well, the obvious is that transition is a value modeled by God, and the example of Jesus ministering to 500 plus individuals over 40 days so that they can properly transition through all that has transpired through his crucifixion and resurrection, I think is a great process, or just a great example of the need for helping people deal with the implications of change.
Second takeaway is that transition is focused on helping people adapt to change. And Jesus is beginning to explain to his disciples all the stuff that's going to happen to him. So he sees the change coming, and he's helping them be prepared for it. And that's one of the things as leaders we're trying to do, is be sensitive and aware of what God is doing in the church, and then helping people get on board with that, recognize that, and start to walk through the ramifications for their own life.
Yeah, and our third transition is simply that transition is only life-giving when it flows from godly love. And really, we've been saying that in every one of these values, the foundation and precondition for walking out these equipping values, it's why it's on the bottom of the template, is that we have a godly love for people. Speaking the truth is relatively simple. Speaking the truth in love is particularly challenging. So, as I stated at the beginning, how a leader transitions servants says a lot about their heart for Jesus's people. And as I can personally attest, it is tempting to bury one's head in the sand, denying the reality of people not doing well. But it's also easy to quickly jettison a servant from a team and just to disown them and to make a quick change. But as we've been going through all of these, Drew, we've been trying to walk in the middle, walk in balance, and emulate Jesus's 5 equipping values. And it's difficult because there are errors on either side of these continuums. So love for you to kind of guide us and counsel us as we come to the end of this process.
That's great, Charlie. My experience with pastors, and as we look at this list, my experience with pastors is most pastors don't start off with the desire to be controlling or to disown people or some of these different things. But instead, what happens is we're moving really quickly. There's a lot of work to be done in the ministry, and we just get caught up in it. So we lose sight of the development process for people. And so it's our lack of attentiveness that allows things to build up and spiral to the point where we swing to the other side of the pendulum. So I'm going to use this one you said here, Charlie, that we deny there's a problem. And a lot of pastors, we don't like change. It's not just our team members. We don't like change. We don't want to fire somebody. Typically, if there's someone on your team, there's a good reason why they were there. There's some degree of affinity and you have a shared history together. And so you don't want to have a hard conversation with them. And you don't want to embrace the fact that they might not be there anymore on your team. And what we tend to do then is we tend to stuff what's obvious. We tend to just deny it. And I've seen this happen so often in ministry. We deny until it builds up to the point where it becomes a deeply emotional and intense experience where often there's years of dysfunction by the time you get to the point where you're forced into having the confrontation conversation. And at that point, so much relational capital has been spent, it does turn into a disowning process. because people have been so hurt by it. And I just go back and I wonder, what if we had been honest earlier and had a hard conversation as soon as we realized there was no viable way forward here? It still would have been painful, but I think it would have opened the door for relationship going forward, and certainly would have been a lot less painful than allowing it to get to the point where it blows up. And it's the same principle that we talked about earlier. A lot of pastors, they delegate and they're not controlling it all. They're just delegating because stuff needs to be done. And then suddenly they wake up one day and realize this is not in alignment with what the church is supposed to be. So then they swing to the other side and become a micromanager. And hopefully you see this tendency that we have. And if we could get to the root of it, it's a lack of attentiveness. It's a focus on doing the work of ministry and not equipping others to do the work of ministry. It's a focus on our personal capacity rather than developing those God has given us. And that's the mindset shift we're going for here. And the common thread in all of this is walking down this middle line takes time. It takes patience and it takes attention. Amen. This will not happen naturally. It will only happen by being willing to recognize that one of your core roles as a leader is to develop your team and develop those around you. Maybe we can end with this thought that we can't control when and how the Spirit moves in the church. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. But what we can do is be a group of disciples that are ready. And we can be those that we're out on the boats and we've tended the nets. We've taken care of our sails. We understand our roles, but ultimately we're trusting Jesus to bring in the catch of fish. And so that's our hope and our prayer for all of us as we grow in this is let's commit to do the slow work. Let's commit to understand our roles and responsibilities correctly. And my conviction is if we'll all do this 50 years from now, as we're sitting back, we're going to see this incredible legacy of people released into God's harvest field. Thanks, everyone. And we look forward to the ongoing dialogue.